Hello, everybody. I'm Jean Gladding of Leading Consciously. What stereotypes do you hold of people of different races, genders, religions, ages, sexualities, and gender expressions? Most people who would be interested in this podcast will claim they don't succumb to stereotypes. That's what I would have said before reading the book we will talk about today. It's called Diversity in the Workplace, eye-opening interviews to jumpstart conversations about identity, privilege, and bias. As you will see, I learned that I actually do have mental models about different groups. Surprising to me, those mental models shifted as I worked through the chapters of this book. You're about to meet the author, Bärí Williams, who has worked in different industries, tech, media, legal, and others. The book is about 25 interviews with people from different marginalized communities. Here she is, prepared to think about a world where people are categorized into different groups, yet everyone is an individual. Hello, everybody. I am beyond thrilled to bring to you Bärí Williams, who has written this fascinating book that I could barely put down called Diversity in the Workplace, Eye-Opening Interviews to Jumpstart Conversations about Identity, Privilege, and Bias. Now, she's an attorney. She's done business operations, emerging technologies, product innovation, supplier diversity. She's got an impressive background, which I'll put all in the show notes. She'll be able to read it. You'll be able to read it. But what she's going to talk about are conversations she had with 25 people, all who were, you don't use the word minority, you have a special word that you use.
Marginalized communities.
Marginalized. Mm-hmm. All who are marginalized in one shape or form. And what I want to say is we started out with race, which was very familiar to me. And I said, okay, this is good. And then we moved on to, I think, gender, and then religion and age. And by the time I finished this book, something about the whole concept of stereotypes shifted in my brain. And I still don't know what shifted, and I'm hoping out of this conversation, some of this might come out, but I can say that something definitely has shifted. Mm-hmm. And I've been on this planet a while. So to have something shift like that is really amazing. So with that as a background, welcome, Bärí.
Thank you, Dr. Jean.
Okay, so I want to ask you, first of all, I've given you my reaction. Why this book? Why did you write the book in the first place? And what do you want people to get out of it?
Yeah, I would say that the impetus for writing it was really born out of the fact that I had been writing a lot of different articles. And I also tend to think, based off of those articles, a lot of people tend to put people in one or two buckets. They usually break things down either through race or gender. And oftentimes those are not the lenses in which people are being viewed, or that's not the sole lens in which they're being viewed. You're also thinking about religion and culture and sexuality and all sorts of things. And I felt like a lot of those potential areas had not been quite as covered, and the intersectionality of them hadn't really been covered at all.
Yes. Well, I can assure you that you covered intersectionality in a way I've never seen before. And that's, again, why I said something shifted in my brain about how I'm thinking about this, that I'm going to be pondering for a while. Okay, so you're saying people were viewed through unidimensional or bidimensional lenses, mm-hmm. and you know that people identify themselves according to multiple lenses. did you find that most of the 25 people you interviewed did have one dominant identity, or did they most have two or more?
That's a good question. Out of the 25 people that I interviewed, only two had one singular identity that they thought was their marginalized identity. The other 23 had two or three of them.
Wow.
Yeah, the only two that felt that they had one identity that was paramount, they were both Asian men. But everyone else, they had two or three.
Wow. Asian
Yeah.
men. And were they in tech?
Yes. Well, one was in tech and one was in media.
Okay. That's very interesting. Okay, so give us a story. Talk about one person and how they navigated the terrain of these multiple, or if you want to choose one, the Asian men, I don't care, but how they navigated the work terrain.
Mhm. Well, I would say one thing that's interesting. So one of the Asian gentlemen was a former colleague of mine, and he still works at that company, and I'm no longer there. But what's interesting about listening to him talk about his journey, he said a lot of how he learned how to navigate the workplace was because he had to first learn how to navigate being a foreigner in a different land. And his parents were Christian missionaries, and so they traveled and they lived in Russia for a long period of time. He went to high school there, and then came to the US to go to University of North Carolina, which is a huge culture shock to go from Russia to North Carolina.
I'm a UNC grad, by the way.
Oh, okay. And so his example was interesting. He learned to speak Russian. And he said one thing that's interesting about it is that experience taught him how to be a chameleon. And that because of his upbringing, he was able to learn how to adapt and fit in wherever he chose to or wherever he would like to, in a way that he learned how to make himself comfortable. So it wasn't that he was necessarily assimilating to where he was, but he took bits and pieces of where he was to make himself comfortable, and then introduced himself in the way that he wanted to be seen in that particular place and space.
Okay, so let's break this down, because this whole thing of being a chameleon is something that a lot of people are struggling with. You know,
Mm-hmm.
if I adapt to this culture, do I lose myself?
Mm-hmm.
So, based on what you said, what do you mean bits and pieces? He took bits and pieces.
Mm-hmm. So I would say, for example, when he moved out to the Bay Area and started working in tech, he lived in San Francisco. Now, he and his wife, they've since started a family, and they were looking for childcare. Well, they ended up finding a place. There's a pretty decent sized Russian community in San Francisco. The childcare that he and his wife found, it was owned by a Russian woman. And one day when he went to pick up his daughter, he heard these women speaking Russian and he understood what they were saying. And so he joined in the conversation, and he said that they were completely shocked because they're not expecting this Korean man to speak Russian and to
Right.
speak back to them. So it's one thing, he didn't just understand what you were saying, but he can respond to you, and joined in the conversation. So it's something as simple as that. And another example that he gave me of when going from Russia to UNC is he started to make friends with a lot of people that were in Black Greek letter organizations. And so his understanding of particular issues that Black students were facing on campus, or that were just cultural issues, he could also understand, not just from the stance of being an outsider, but because he was actively an ally. And so he also took up that same kind of spirit and attitude while we worked together. And I saw it. He was an active member of our Black employee resource group, and he's Korean. And so, but to him, he feels like being an ally means actively showing up and using his ability and his privilege in a way that would be beneficial for someone else. And so that's what he meant by bits and pieces, is he learned how to make himself comfortable in other places, but he never is not John who is Korean. He's still always John who's Korean. He's just John who is Korean, who knows about step shows and can speak Russian to you. So he's very multifaceted.
That is fascinating. And so I'm trying to fix. So he first, you're saying he had a strong sense of self. He had a
Mm-hmm.
strong sense of who he was, and he had enough varied experiences, like ability to speak Russian, or having been othered in Russia, for example.
Mm-hmm.
So that when he went into another place in a Black community, a Black setting, he could pull his otherness and relate
Mm-hmm. Because he'd already been through that. And
because he
so
had
it,
already been to that.
yeah, it was a perfect example of, okay, I can relate to this because I've experienced it. And but it also was something where he didn't feel uncomfortable being an only. And that is something that I always think is interesting, because a lot of these folks in these stories, they were the only. And whether that was they were the only Muslim, or they were the only person that was LGBTQ, or they were the only Asian, or they were the only Black person. And so for him, it was his experience of having been several different places, of being the only, where he was like, oh, okay, well, I've done this before. So this is cool. I know how to do this. And he that experience actually makes him comfortable wherever he is, because he knows how to navigate it.
So do you think the feeling that a lot of us get about being the only in a setting, do you think that's just lack of familiarity, or do you think there's something environmental or something in the setting itself that's creating that?
I think it's a both and, not an either or.
Okay.
So I think that it's definitely something that has to do with that particular space and place. And it has to do with that, the culture of wherever you happen to find yourself. And I think that there's also something different about a level of expectation of people either expecting to see you or expecting for you not to be there at all. So being the only may not be an issue for John, because particularly working in tech, he is an Asian man working in tech. That's not an anomaly in tech. Now, John going to a step show, that's an anomaly.
Well, first, for people who don't know what a step show is,
Oh, yeah.
which
Yeah. So a step show is something that Black Greek letter organizations do, the Divine Nine. It's their it is our way of community,
yeah.
A fun way of experiencing community.
Okay.
But for John, he's happy to go to that because he's comfortable with it. But he's also happy to, because he's used to being in a tech space and people expect him there, that he can walk into a room and advocate for someone that may not be in that room, because he already has a certain level of cachet by being there. They expect you there. Versus if I walk in a room and say someone should be there, or why isn't this person here? Sometimes you can be met with a little bit of an attitude that's like, well, why aren't you just happy to be here?
Please elaborate on that. I hear that so much.
Yeah. I would say that has been a a paramount issue and theme, particularly of working in tech, is that they don't expect to see Black folks usually, and they especially don't expect to see Black women. And so to be both, and then I think there are other elements that kind of play into that, which I also think about confirmation bias. Like, you already come into a situation expecting someone to be a certain way. So you're not going to meet that person. You're going to be meeting the little things you want to pick apart that confirm what you already thought this person would be like. And so if your idea of a Black woman is outspoken or assertive, kind of intimidating, well, then it doesn't help that I'm also 5'10". So I walk into a room and there's kind of not a way that you can't see me, because I'm a woman, I'm Black, I'm tall. When my hair is down, I have long curly hair. There's nothing really subtle about my presence in a room. And so it's very different that, people often will kind of mistake you for someone else, think that you do a job or in a role that you're not in. And I've had that happen where people presume that I wasn't the attorney on the deal. I was the secretary, or I was the person that was there to transcribe.
Yeah, we all get that.
Mhm.
Yeah.
But it's one of those things where I wouldn't say you become numb or indifferent to it. It's just I don't at this point, it's not so much as being offended by it, so much as I will correct you and make sure that you understand that that's not what I'm doing. But also, you shouldn't necessarily presume that about anyone that walks in the door that may look a certain way.
So, okay, so if you're the person walking in the door, how do you let go of your stereotypes? What do you mean you shouldn't presume?
I mean that, I walked into a deal once when I had my hair was dad, big curly hair. I had on jeans, and I was 8 months pregnant. And I think I had blue nail polish. And so I walk in this room to do a deal, and the opposing counsel was already sitting there with her client. And I just came and sat down, and I heard her say to my client, "Well, when is your attorney getting here?" And meanwhile, she had already she'd been talking the entirety of the time I was sitting there for about 5 minutes, and it basically relayed her entire negotiation strategy. Now, I'm not going to look a gift horse in the mouth, so I'm not going to say, "Here I am." I just let her talk. And then when she finally asked again, asked my client, "Well, where's your attorney?" And he said, "She's been sitting here the whole time. Like, that's her." And the woman turned bright red, and she was so embarrassed. And I just said, "It's okay." I said, "It's totally okay." I said, "But I'm going to let you know now, since I already heard you, I'm not going to acquiesce on this, or this point." I was like, "But we could talk about the rest." And she kind of chuckled, and that put her at ease. But it was also enough for her to just me just waving at her after he said, "Well, she's right there." I didn't have to say anything. It's just, and that's why I think she turned red, is this the fact that she was embarrassed that she had a presumption about who and what I was before I even said a word. I literally was sitting silently at the table.
Right. Right. And so she imposed her presumptions on you. Okay, you say that you aren't offended.
Mm-mm.
What do you think makes the difference between, and I noticed in this book of these 25 people, some of those who encountered not as dramatic a situations what you just described, but
Mhm.
encountered whatever situations they encountered were not offended, and a couple were set back. What do you think makes the difference with that? Let me
I think that there is, for me, and there have been times when I've been offended. I would say that there's a level of intentionality that will kind of create the difference between whether you're offended by a comment or you're not, and you just have to gently correct somebody in the right direction. I've definitely had moments where I've been offended because I think that it wasn't just a negative presumption that you had, but it almost feels as if the question was being asked intentionally to slight me or to make me feel small.
I see. Okay. So if you think that if the comment comes out of some kind of malice,
Right.
or disdain, then
Yeah, I used to work for a company, and one of the things that they would beat the drum on repeatedly, like it was incessant, was assume good intent. And I'm not doing that after the third time.
with the same person.
Right. I'm not assuming good intent anymore after that, because that's gone. So if I assume good intent the first time and then I corrected you, and then you do it a second time and I correct you again, by the third time, that's run out. So it's the intentionality behind it.
Okay. So let's back up and talk about you and who you are and where you came from, so that you were motivated to write this book.
Yeah. What am I? Where did I come from? I came from Oakland. I always start with that. I am a girl from Oakland. And that is really pertinent to who I am, because I grew up living in a kind of dual environment.
Yeah, say
And
about Oakland for those. You're talking about California.
Yes.
Okay, so
So it's California. And both sets of my grandparents moved to California in the 40s from other places. So, and of course, they're bringing their personal experience and narratives of that to California. And so it's interesting to have kind of Southern and Midwestern sensibilities in terms of the personal family culture, but then California is incredibly diverse. And I would say the Bay Area, particularly when I was growing up here, is, and I still live here, was incredibly diverse. I would say that when I grew up in Oakland, the population was probably a third, a third, and a third. So you had a third of the population was Black, a third of the population was white, a third of the population was Asian. Or maybe I should actually discount some of those, because we had also had a decent sized Hispanic Latino community. So I would say that it was really inclusive. And I never ran into problems as a child with other students, other kids, like everyone played together. Like it was totally fine. It was a foreign concept to my grandparents, which was very interesting to kind of navigate with them, because they're like, wait, I don't understand how you're going to go spend the night at this person's house. Like they invited you to do that. Like, yeah. Like trying to explain that to my grandfather was very odd, but he didn't understand it. But he also was the first person to integrate his basketball team. So, and he fought in World War II. And so you're hearing those stories while I'm living a completely different experience. So it's a good blend of how do you keep some of that close and understand how that's foundational, but also understand and respect the fact that this is a different experience that I'm having based off of that. So I would say a large part of it was my family, and that's how I came to care about this. My mom, there's something called the oratorical competition here in California, and there was an HBO documentary about it, I think like 2 or 3 years ago. And she and 4 other teachers in the Oakland Unified School District started it when I was in first grade. And it's something that still keeps going. And because she wanted, and she also made sure that it didn't just happen during Black History Month. My mom is a huge proponent of like, I'm not teaching Black History Month in February. I deliberately do it in other months because Black history is American history. And so seeing that modeled is something that really stayed with me. It wasn't something that people needed to, teach or lecture. It was, I saw it being modeled around me.
Okay, so you grew up in a diverse community, a very diverse community.
Mm-hmm.
And you grew up with, I'm going to use the word progressive parents.
Sure.
If
Yes.
your mama is saying, I'm not teaching Black history in February, that's pretty advanced.
Oh, well, I see, to me, it's just, that's Linda. I don't.
Yes, that is. Okay, so you grew up with that, aware, socially aware. Let me say that.
Yes, very much so.
Socially aware parents. So and that was part of your upbringing. So it would make sense that you would then notice difference and be motivated and notice how difference is being treated and be motivated to do this book.
Yeah.
Okay.
I would say that one thing that did stick with me in particular, was also seeing how my mother would react when she perceived a slight, or that she perceived that someone was slighting me. I had a high school counselor, and I went to an all girls private Catholic school, and the guidance counselor, when we were applying for colleges, I had a list of places I wanted to go. My mother had her input of where she wanted me to add to that list. She did not win. And so when I took the list to the counselor, and this was an older white woman, she looked at it and she said, oh, well, honey, you shouldn't even bother to apply to some of these because affirmative action is over in California. So because I had Cal and UCLA and UC Davis on my list. And so I went home that day and I was like, wow, that's crazy. And my mom was sitting at dinner. She asked me what happened. And I said, well, the counselor told me I shouldn't apply to these schools because you all voted affirmative action out last year. So now it's not taken into account for admissions. And so I shouldn't bother because I probably won't get in.
So you believe the lady. Okay, go
No,
ahead.
I didn't believe her. That's what she said. I just told my mom what she said.
Right.
And so the next day, my mom drops me off at school before she heads to work, and she parked the car. And I said, what are you doing? And she's like, oh, I just want to go in and have a little chat. She went in and had a little chat. And that woman was the nicest person she could be to me after that day, and made sure that I had anything I needed throughout the process of applying. And I had no greater joy than to go back when we got admissions and to wave my acceptance letter to Berkeley in her face. And that's where I ended up going.
Wow.
So, yeah, but it was just something like that where my mom was like, no, that's not for you to handle. I'll do it.
What was the chat? Do you know what your mother said?
I don't know exactly what she said, but I know that that woman completely changed her demeanor, and she didn't change it with just me. She changed it with the other Black girls that she was counseling and was telling, oh, you shouldn't apply to this school, or don't apply to Stanford, don't do this. And yeah, she had already done that to a couple of girls, and we all ended up getting in. So so it didn't matter.
Wow. Okay, so I want to ask you a question. I'm shifting gears here. In reading your book, people talk sometimes about how they want to be recognized. This is going to be a convoluted question, and so I'm going to try to ask it succinctly. Give me a moment here.
Okay.
On the one hand, there's wanting to be accepted for who you are and to fit in and to be recognized. On the other hand, there's the challenge of wanting to change the culture or recognizing that maybe I shouldn't fit in with the culture. The culture should fit in with, should change to accommodate me. And you can see that around hair, the jabab for Muslim women, or froze with Black women. How do you stand on that? And what was the experience of the people that you interviewed around that?
Yeah, I would say that the majority of them seem to feel as if that, they knew how to assimilate. Several of them had done it in different capacities during school or at other workplaces. So that wasn't foreign to them. But I think what was interesting was a couple of them, particularly Black women, I noticed it was 3 of them, that kind of it hit a point where they just said, you know what, I'm tired of like having to do this for other people's comfort. And what about my own comfort? I'm tired of doing this for other people's comfort. And they left and started their own businesses. So, and that's another thing, is the Black women are the largest slate of entrepreneurs for the last, I think, 15 years. So
wow, I didn't know that.
Yes. So they leave corporate jobs and then go and start their own businesses, because you hit a point where, like, I'm tired of trying to fit into what somebody else thinks is professional or appropriate, or, whatever it is that they deem is okay at that point. And I think that the majority of the people that I interviewed felt like it should be a blend, that yes, I can adapt to the company culture, but also the company culture should be receptive to other people having critiques or suggestions or things that they could improve upon. I think one really great example was a gentleman who he had previously had a drinking problem, and he which is hard when you work in a restaurant and you're a sommelier, right? Like, probably should find a different line of work. And he eventually did. And he became a software coder. And one thing that he did say, and this was interesting because when I was interviewing him, I said, yeah, I totally understand this and agree that tech companies have a very heavy happy hour and drinking culture. And he suggested to his company, because he's sober, why don't we have any other group activities that don't revolve around alcohol? And so they started planning hikes and going bowling and doing other things.
They adapted to his suggestion?
Mhm.
Wow.
Yeah. And I thought that was a great idea, because that's another piece of it, is like all disabilities or different abilities are not visible, or they're not things that people want to disclose to you or tell you. He wasn't necessarily eager to tell people about his personal background. He's much more comfortable doing so now because he's been sober for a while. But, at the time, to him, it's just like, I have to, in order to be seen as a team player and that I'm part of the group, I have to go to these events where I'm personally uncomfortable because it's nothing but people getting drunk. And I'm trying to actively avoid that. And so he said, he couched it as, well, why don't we try to do something different? Or why don't we do something that has a focus on a healthy activity? So let's try being outdoors. So they hiked, they started bowling, they started doing all kinds of different things. So, and kudos to him, because he was able to suggest it, but also suggest it in a way that made it palatable for other people to say, oh yeah, that's a great idea.
Well, I noticed you used the word healthy. So if he used that, would make it palatable. That if he's saying, let's do healthy stuff.
Well, it could, or it could also be off-putting by making the people that you're suggesting this to, make them think, oh, well, you're engaging in unhealthy behavior and you're encouraging it of the employees. So it really depends on how you take it.
That's right. You're absolutely right about that.
Because the people that are actively drinking or fine with it are going to think, well, is this person judging me?
Right. Right. Okay. So you gave me that one concrete example with the recovering alcoholic. Can you think of another example where people made a suggestion and it was either accepted or not accepted? I'm still on this whole thing of when do you fit in and when do you suggest a change? So I'd like to see examples of change suggestions.
Yes. I would say that something that, well, I don't know that it was necessarily a explicit change, but it was modeled behavior, in the sense that I can say that I started to see more people coming into workplaces embracing the idea of come as you are. And I can say for myself personally, when I started at a tech company, I took that with a grain of salt. Like I said, okay, that's great. That probably applies to somebody else. That does not apply to me. And I distinctly remember going through the entire interview process with straight, flat ironed hair. And when I got the role and accepted, I showed up on my first day with curly hair. And it was funny because when I went to sit at my seat finally, they were like, oh, wow, you look different. I was like, mm-hmm. And there were a couple questions, but there weren't really questions after that. I think it was just a surprise because I looked one way during the interview process and then I start and I looked different.
Did you were you deliberate about that? You deliberately straightened your hair?
Yeah, I was very deliberate about it.
Okay. And you knew you were going to show up as you are. Oh, that's fascinating.
Yeah. So, I mean, I'm already here. So what are you going to do? I still the same person. I just am not flat ironing my hair.
I'm just reminded of a TV show that I won't go into where a woman did that with hysterical repercussions.
Oh, okay.
So that's fascinating that you did that, and you kept the job, I'm assuming.
Yeah, totally fine. But also, I was the first Black woman in that group. And so when other Black women joined, it wasn't a big deal to see someone walking around with natural hair.
Okay.
Like you see someone with braids one day, and then 3 weeks later they come back with flat iron hair, and then 2 weeks after that their hair is curly. Like, you're not asking questions because you've already seen it.
Right. Okay. What does it take for a person to make a suggestion to change the culture if you're the target in the target group?
Courage. I would say courage. I think a big piece of what was kind of emblematic through all of these stories is that there was a certain level of inherent discomfort with being vocal about things that may rock the boat. And so there was always kind of a internal monologue about, what should you say? Should you bother saying it? What happens if it's not received well? You're playing out all of these scenarios before you actively do it. And I think it's one, having courage, but two, it's also knowing your audience and knowing how someone will best receive information. And I think that's something else that I learned from my mom, which is why I didn't have necessarily as much hesitation with certain things, is that as a teacher, she and my grandmother always reminded me that kids learn differently. And so some kids want handouts, some kids are tactile, some kids need repetition. And so the thing that they always said is, you have to give people information in the way that they best receive it, not in the, you have to give information in the way that they best receive it, not in the way that you want to deliver it. And so it's understanding who you're speaking to and what's going to make something palatable for them. So what are they? Data driven? Then you need to lead with data. Are they empaths? Do they want to do the right thing? Then lead with that. And then also even just the little things. Do they prefer meetings in person? Do they want to do it on Zoom? Do they just want an email? You have to understand what is the best way to connect to your audience, and the audience being the person you're giving this suggestion to. So you have to know these things beforehand so that you can deliver this message that's taking you courage to deliver, but you're doing it in a way in which they're going to be most receptive.
So how do you find that information out? Do you ask? You had been trained to observe and see, but how would most people find out what you're saying?
I think that that's one thing that you can be afforded, particularly as someone new in an organization. I always take advantage of that whenever I'm new somewhere, is to ask people, what is it that they prefer? Do you prefer for me to send you an email, or do you want me to send you a chat? Do you want a meeting versus a phone call? Like, all of those things are figuring out what's the way that people are most receptive. And also, I'm a big fan of pattern matching. And I think working in tech has been really great for that. And also being married to an engineer is great for that. You look at patterns and see, like, okay, well, I see that this person tends to say yes more often when information is presented this way. Or I've noticed that they're not really open to conversations, at certain times after 4:00 on Wednesdays. So it's understanding kind of little nuance things like that. So it's observation, and then based off of those observations, it's pattern matching to see if you can find something that's consistent. And then if you're new, it's always good to you can just ask.
Yeah. I guess I'm listening to you thinking how many people don't even know that they're supposed to pay attention to stuff like that. And how fortunate you were to be raised in an environment where that's what you were taught, to pay attention to how people want to receive information. So many people are afraid of how they are being perceived, that they don't think about how they are perceiving others.
Right. And I think part of what's a bit scary about that is that if you are so consumed with, if you're so consumed with how someone else is going to perceive you, you're not thinking about how do they want to receive you? What can you do to influence that perception? And it's going to be, how do you interact with them? And in order to do that successfully, you need to know what it is that they are conducive to saying yes to, or what they like. And so a lot of that is really just paying attention to things that sometimes other people are not going to catch or don't care to catch. So that's something that I say again.
You just said a mouthful, because what you're saying, I'm running through 5 people right now who are obsessed with how they're being perceived.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't see them saying anything about how they're perceiving others or influencing others' perception of them, what you just said.
Mm-hmm. I think that that's something that people tend to miss, because they tend to be so focused on what is it that I'm doing, or how can I make myself stand out to them, but a lot of it is, if you're giving them this message in the wrong way, they're not going to pick it up. So it's not just about how you think that you're being perceived, or focus on how you're being perceived. It's, what are the things that they are amenable to? And if you don't know that, you could tap dance and do everything else in front of them, and they're not going to get it.
As you're talking, I think, and she ended up in law. I mean,
yes,
that's great prep for the law field.
Yeah. It's a blessing and a curse, I would say. It was great that my mom taught me how to do that. I think I've doubled down on that a bit too much with my kids, particularly my son. So there's nothing like having a 13-year-old argue with you.
Oh my God, yes.
About a point, and I have to actually listen to it because it's a good point. And he's come to me and he's doing it the way that I would be amenable to listening. And he's giving me the reasons, and I'm just like, I don't want to have to say yes to this. But I mean, it's good training.
Oh yeah. Yeah. We raise these children to be independent and bright and forward and all that, and then they pull it.
Yeah, but not against me.
Yeah, this is not.
Yeah, don't use my own tricks against me.
There we go. Okay, so I want to go to another question. You wrote about several points in the book. You talked about the long game and the short game.
Mm-hmm.
Could you talk about that and illustrate it with a story?
Yes. So I think something that's important. I had a colleague when I worked at Facebook, and he's still there, and he's so lovely. I cannot say enough good things about this man. And there were things that I would want to do there, and he would just tell me, oh, Bärí, just wait, just slow it down a little bit, pump your brakes, we'll get there. And I would be so frustrated, like, why are you not going to sign on for this? Why don't you think this is a great idea? And I would wait a couple months, and then I understood why he was waiting. And he was playing the long game, and I was playing a short game. Like, well, we need this right now. And he's like, yeah, we need this right now, but if we could wait and leverage it for something bigger in 3 months, why wouldn't we do that? And so watching him was fascinating, because everything about how he operates and did things was set up to play a long game. And I would say it has worked. It has worked for him. But I would say that it hasn't necessarily worked for everyone else. I think that there needs to be certain understanding and folks to be cognizant of the fact that there are always going to be, in certain organizations, chosen people. And those people are going to be anointed, and there's nothing that they can do wrong, or those are the people that are I don't know a good way to put it, but those are the people that if they say yes, then you're going to say that their yes is the yes for the entire group, even if it's not. And so the long game works really well for him and sometimes was very beneficial for our employee resource group. But in the short term, it could be the opposite for everyone else. And for some of those folks, they were kind of lost in the struggle.
Okay, I got lost here. Let's be concrete.
Mm-hmm.
Make up any scenario to illustrate how it would work for him, but not for the group.
Okay. So if there was something that was happening at the company and it was particularly targeted to a certain demographic, in this case, I can say it was for Black employees, and it was a negative. And
can you be really concrete? Make up an example.
If there were certain types of speech that were being permitted that we didn't feel was conducive to inclusion, right. Not just necessarily based off of for employees, but also for the users. Mm-hmm. And it felt emblematic of, well, if we're tolerating this on the inside, then how can we say anything about keeping people safe that are using the platform on the outside? And wanting to play a shorter game is, well, let's have a conversation about this with the entire company. Like, let's have this conversation versus saying, no, let's just wait a couple months and we might be able to kind of put that in the piggy bank and then save up for something greater later. And that may be fine for certain people that have the wherewithal to wait until later. But for other people that were necessarily dealing with that on a more personal and concrete level, that wasn't going to fly. And so, meaning that some people, it was a more immediate concern for them. It wasn't something that they felt that they could wait on or that they should. And to a certain extent, that's how you lose people at companies as well, is that they don't want to wait for their needs to be addressed. And sometimes if you have someone who is kind of emblematic of the group, even if they may not be for everyone, then whatever that person says goes. That may not work for the majority.
Okay, so let me give you the example that popped in my head and tell me if this is what you're saying. So there is a man there, and he's sort of the informal Black leader, in this employee resource group. Mm-hmm. There's a woman over here who's being called the B word, and the people around her constantly talking about the B word and calling people a bunch of you-know-whats and all of that. So she's hearing it. Mm-hmm. He's over here looking at the big picture.
Right.
And he's not bothered by that because it's not in his line of consciousness. So she wants the immediate conversation addressed about how should we talk to one another. Mm-hmm. And he's saying, well, let's wait. Maybe we can leverage it for more.
Right. We can do something larger for the community later if we just kind of stockpile all of these microaggressions and slights and we just build a piggy bank of them.
Right.
And then we can cash them all in for something big. But the problem is that doesn't affect this person's day to day.
Right.
That person has to be in the trenches and deal with it. And it's not just that person. It could be 10 other people along with that person.
Right.
But if this one man is sort of the de facto leader, then whatever he's going to say to some of the higher ups is what they're going to take as gospel.
Right.
And so,
oh God, yes.
Yeah. And that's a different story for a different day. I've seen that as well with diversity officers in different companies where they're not so much there for the marginalized communities they're supposed to be. It's more so a rubber stamp for what it is that the executives want to do. And they just need somebody to say, well, we talked to the diversity person.
Right.
So that's a difficult place to be. And I recognize how hard that job must be as well, because you're there wanting to advocate for these folks, but you also understand that this is your personal role and what's at stake for you.
Right. And how many times can you go back to the well and draw water before
Exactly.
there's none left?
Exactly.
Okay. One last question. I hope it's last. Sometimes I say one last question, then I have 1,000 more. So one soon to be last question. Let me revise that. This is with the LGBTQ community.
Mm-hmm.
You say on the one hand, there was several places in the book, don't ask what somebody's background is, what their identity is. Don't ask.
Mm-hmm.
In another place, pronouns are important.
Mm-hmm.
So I've been in a situation where literally I was trying to figure out what to do with this pronoun person because I suspected the person was gay, but I wasn't sure.
Mm-hmm.
So I relied on they, talking I just used they a lot. But I thought that if I had just been able to ask, our whole conversation would have flowed better.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't think that is inaccurate, but I also come from a school of thought that people will tell you what they want you to know. And so just like if that person corrected you about their pronouns, it's because they wanted you to know. But I think that there is a certain level of discomfort between the person that's asking the question and the person that has to answer it, because there's a lot of confusion or harboring of guilt potentially in terms of, well, oh, I hope this person doesn't think that I misgendered them, or I see them a certain way. What if they think that I think that they're a woman but they're non-binary, and then they're wondering how you perceive them. So both parties are in this kind of quagmire.
That's exactly what I'm talking about.
Yeah, but I think to me it's always safer to allow someone to correct you than it is for you to presume. Or, sometimes if you are really, really unsure and it's gone on for a while, sometimes I think it is okay to ask. You say like, hey, do you have preferred pronouns? And it may not be a long drawn out conversation. It's just, hey, what are your preferred pronouns?
Okay. So in this case, so let me give you a concrete thing that happened. I had occasion to work with a woman, and we had worked together for several months. And I kept thinking, she's lesbian. And so finally one day I just asked. She said, why would you ask me a question like that? And I said, well, I'm in the School of Social Work. And what I've learned is not to presume heterosexuality. So I'm not going to make an assumption. I want to do it correctly. She said, oh, okay. And then she said, yes, I am gay. I think she used the word gay. And after that, our relationship completely changed. And she got friendly with me, more disclosing with me. So her initial reaction was to pull away. Would you ask me a question like that? And when I gave the explanation, it was like I had passed a platform.
It was kind of like letting you into the inner sanctum. So
yes. I was let in a way that I never would have been. And so every time I hear don't ask, or people will tell you, what if they don't? I mean, why would she tell me that? She would have no reason to voluntarily tell me that. So if I had not asked, we never would have crossed into that threshold. But on the other hand, I want to respect someone's privacy. So I'm genuinely torn on this.
Yeah, I would say I tend to err on the side of caution.
Okay.
Just because I feel like people will correct you if they feel the need to correct you. And that's the other thing with particularly with pronouns is that, and it's interesting to like have to walk through this with my son, because at school they're very open with asking what so-and-so's pronouns.
Oh, they
And
do?
yeah,
What grade is he in?
he's in 8th grade.
In 8th grade, they're asking that question?
Mhm.
Fascinating.
Yeah. And there are a couple kids who prefer they them. So that's what they do. And but I think even for him, he just couldn't, he was trying to wrap his mind around. He was like, but I can't ask somebody this. So how am I supposed to just intuitively know? And I said, you don't intuitively know. You, if you're standing there talking with them and you're not using their name, and a pronoun comes up, use the pronoun that you think you're supposed to use. And then if you're incorrect, somebody will correct you. And then it's your responsibility to say, oh, okay, got it. Now I know I'll refer to them as they, them, or I'll refer to her as she prefers she or they. So it's understanding the difference there. And I will say that that's something that I appreciate that is interesting about a younger generation, and seeing how that progressed from my grandfather, like not understanding how I got invited to a sleepover.
Yes, right.
To my son saying like, oh yeah, she goes by she, they. Like, okay. Like just casually, like go from one generation to the next, where it's just not a big deal. And I have no idea what that's going to look like when he has kids. But I think that there's something to be said for how open that is, where it's also people, at least I notice, people are more open to correction and are also more open to giving it. That's also something that people were not used to doing. If they were the person that really wanted to correct you, they still wouldn't.
That's why I have such a problem with it, because I know so many people who would never make the correction.
Yeah, I've even done that with my name, and that's not nearly as personal as something where you're misgendering me. But I let an entire law school teacher call me Bärí for a semester.
That's what I'm talking. That's why, yes.
Well, and I finally went to office hours and said, I don't have a question. I just wanted to tell you that this is how you pronounce my name. But I didn't want to do it in front of a class of 60 people. So that's also something. You don't want to make the person that you're asking uncomfortable or embarrassed. And you also, the person who's asking for the correction, you don't want to make them embarrassed either. That's why you got to get into the inner circle, is because you asked in a very caring and sensitive way.
Yes, this whole subject is, I think, this is going to sound very far-fetched, but why we have wars. We don't know how to talk to each other. We don't embarrass each other. All of that. Okay, so what do you want people to take away from this conversation?
I want people to take away from the conversation I really feel like it's about putting yourself in other people's shoes. And sometimes you're going to be the person that's seeking correction, and sometimes you're going to be the person that is correcting. And because you're going to be in each of those different positions, remember what that feels like when you have to do it. And I think that something else that is very key to take away from it is that I always say, like, allyship costs you nothing. It doesn't cost anything to be kind to somebody or to understand somebody's personal perspective, because everybody goes through something. It may not be in one of those 5 segments in the book, but there's going to be some level of hardship that people can relate to some degree, whether it is, I didn't even cover mental health necessarily in there, but that's something completely different. But that's something that I feel like people can take away, is that put yourself in the other person's position. When is a time that you have felt excluded? It doesn't have to be in any of those particular categories. Everyone has felt excluded at some point in time for some reason. And how did that make you feel? And how would you have wanted somebody to actively incorporate you into what was going on?
Okay, so you used the term allyship, and you have, in effect, explained it. but I'd like you to define it as you mean it. You said allyship costs you nothing. What are you saying?
Allyship, to me, I feel like ally is a verb. A lot of people feel that ally is a noun. I don't think that it is just a noun. Yes, that can describe, that is a person who is empathetic to your plight and may want to find a way to help. But as ally as a verb, that is someone that is actively engaged in the process of helping those marginalized communities that they are in allyship with. And that means, are you using your privilege to the benefit of someone else who does not have that access and opportunity? And that is the difference between being an ally and somebody who is what I call a hashtag activist. Anybody can hop on Twitter or Facebook or Instagram and, turn your profile picture black for a day on Juneteenth. That's great. What is that actively doing? Did you register people to vote? Did you take people to the polls? Did you, have you volunteered at a school, at an underserved school? Have you offered internships to people in the companies that you work for? Those are all active things. So I'm not moved by someone changing their Twitter or Instagram profile for a day or two. That doesn't actively do anything. Show me where you are active and I will show you an ally.
Okay. So I want to point out that you've used the word privilege multiple times in this conversation as a positive thing to be asset to be used.
Mm-hmm.
And most people think a lot of people think of privilege now as an insult, something that to be hurled at, something to claim you don't have. So just say a bit about who has privilege.
I think there are myriad ways you can have privilege. It's essentially just a special advantage of some sort. And that could be based on socioeconomics, that could be based on race, could be based on gender, could be based on aesthetics. That's something else. I have a whole sorority sister that wrote a book called Pretty Privilege. So
yes,
there are all kinds of different ways to experience privilege. There's privilege of educational attainment and opportunity. So there are lots of different ways that you can use your privilege, whatever that may look like, to advance someone that doesn't have access to that same privilege. And to me, that's something else that I thought was interesting that resonated with me. When I graduated from Berkeley, Michael Eric Dyson was our Black graduation speaker, and he ended his speech by telling us to be Trojan horses. And
explain that. That is so cool.
He said that it was our job to be Trojan horses, to go into these companies and go into these places and communities and spaces where other people that were like us, that did not have our privilege, like maybe you're not college educated, maybe you didn't, or you are, but you didn't go to Berkeley, so you don't know this particular person or didn't have this internship. It's your job to go in and represent those people that don't have the ability to be in there with you. And so for me, that's how I look at it. That's how I look at privilege and allyship, is use it to be a Trojan horse. And it could be something as simple as, wow, you know who has a great idea about this project we're working on? Tim. So next time we should invite Tim to the meeting. Tim may not have been invited to the meeting if someone didn't say invite Tim to the meeting. So it could be something as simple as that, as let that person come and showcase their talents and their ability, and someone else not kind of parrot it or be the messenger and take credit for it. Let that person show their own skill set.
And that's the active allyship you're talking about.
Yes.
And I have to say, that's also showing up in the interview with your hair straight and then showing up to work the next day.
Right.
And letting the little hidden soldiers in your body come out.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. And that's, to me, was very personal. And for me, it's sometimes the personal is professional, that I want to showcase not just to my coworkers and to the company that I'm still going to do a great job regardless if my hair is curly, straight, in braids or whatever. But also it's demonstrating to my kids that you can show up as yourself and you're still just as immensely qualified as anybody else there.
Okay. So tell me, how can people get in touch with you?
Oh, sure. I'm on LinkedIn. My name is exactly as it is on the Zoom here. It's Bärí A. Williams, all one word, on LinkedIn. That is also my name on Twitter. It's also my name on Instagram. So I'm the same name everywhere. It's
Okay.
very few people that have that name, apparently.
And you're apparently easy to reach if you're on all of them.
Yes.
Okay. Well, this has been a delight. I really appreciate your willingness to uh, join me in a conversation like this. You have given me some nuggets to think about. I'm going to still ponder this whole ask, don't ask, let them volunteer, but maybe they won't conundrum.
Yeah. And I think also that's it may be situational too. So
yes,
it could be, where you read the room a bit.
Yes. Yes.
But you still didn't say how your perspective shifted after. What's the shift that you noticed? Or what's different?
What's different is that I realize how easy I do this work. So therefore, by definition, I don't do stereotypes. Because of course I'm too sophisticated and aware to do stereotypes. But story after story, I would settle into a picture of who this person is, and then that would get disrupted by another facet of them that would come out. You see what I'm saying? And then so I then go to the next story, another mental model, let's not call it stereotype. And then I get settled in that, and then something would happen, and I say, "Oh, I miss. This person is more complex." So if that happens 25 times, after a while, I'm not going into the story predisposing myself that this person is male, or this person is an alcoholic, or this person is whatever, a missionary. I'm not predisposing. I'm going into the next story with a more wait and see mind.
Right. So you're looking at that person as an individual.
Yeah.
And you're reading each story as an individual story, as opposed to how they're grouped in the book. Like, oh, okay, well, this is the chapter on race. So, okay, let me read this, and it's going to be their whole issue is going to be about race. And it wasn't. Sometimes it was race and gender. Sometimes it was race and religion. It could be myriad things.
I think, yes, I think what you said, that's just it. It was fascinating to me because because of the work I do, I say people form mental models. We just do. We just have to. Our brains are wired to form mental models. But when I found that my mental models relaxing, and this is me who doesn't fall into that trap, and yet I discovered I do fall into that trap. And the book shifted me out of it in a way that I didn't even know was available.
That you could shift out of.
Yes.
Yeah. I honestly, even writing it, it was interesting. I would say Doug, who was the he's the recovering alcoholic who was bisexual and also had mental health and depression issues. So that story to me was one of the most interesting. And the other that was the most interesting because it was so like, I would have never thought that I would have never put all these things together, was Charlotte. And Charlotte was a trans woman from Texas who was, she's a veteran and is lesbian. And I was just like, interviewing her was just like, every single thing you thought was just dismantled. Because you have an idea, even if you don't think you have an idea, you have an idea of what is a veteran military man from Texas going to be like. And then you find out that that veteran military man from Texas transitioned into being a woman who's now a human rights activist who's a lesbian. Not at all how you thought that story would go.
Yeah.
And completely fascinating, but it's also tells you don't judge a book by its cover. But also it's very much an individual story at the same time.
It is an individual story.
Yeah.
And I think that's what was fascinating. The individuals came out through the labels. Bärí, I have really enjoyed this. It has been provocative. As I was saying, in terms of my mental models and stereotypes, it's been mind-opening. And I really appreciate your sharing your time with us.
Likewise, I'm glad to do it. I hope you keep reading and keep your mind open and things keep coming and surprising you.
Okay. Bye.
Bye-bye.
In my intro, I said, prepare to think about a world where people are categorized into groups, yet everyone is an individual. This is my main takeaway. We really can just suspend judgment when meeting someone and see them as an individual with multiple identifications and personality characteristics, rather than just locking into one stereotype that jumps out at us. We can recognize that how all of that is put together to make up this one individual may be different from how that's put together to form another. Both Bärí and I are Black women, for example. But what that means for her is different from what it means for me, even though there are definite commonalities we have as Black women. My second takeaway is the whole question of how to talk about differences when meeting someone. I gave an example of my asking a woman I knew if she preferred women, although she was originally put off by my asking it. The whole barrier of her having to conceal who she was from me dissolved, and our relationship was closer as a result. Bärí is clear that people should be allowed to disclose on their own, yet she also agreed there may be a context where it makes sense. So I leave it for all of us to make that determination. My third takeaway is she was taught at a young age by her mother and grandmother to pay attention to how people receive information so you can better get your message across. That's so striking to me. So many people are worried about how someone else is perceiving them, yet it doesn't occur to them that they can influence how they are perceived by delivering information to the person in a way that that person is most likely to receive it. The fourth and last takeaway is how she views allyship. She was quite clear that for her, ally is a verb. It's something you do. The question is, how are you using your privilege to support and advance those who are marginalized in your setting? How are you bringing them into community with the others and promoting what they have to offer? That's a great reminder for us all that we have the opportunity to use our assets and privileges to advance those who don't have what we have. You can learn more about Bärí in the notes below. I'm Jean Gladdick, and I have great news. My co-author and I have a new book coming out in July. It's called Conscious Change: How to Navigate Differences and Foster Inclusion in Everyday Relationships. The book describes how 19 authors applied the skills of conscious change to navigate the same tricky terrain that Bärí is talking about in her book. This is Jean Ramsey's and my second book that we have co-authored together. You can click on the link below or go to our website at leadingconsciously.com. I encourage you to pre-order the book. Thank you for being here and for listening.